The road to the Amish valley twisted like a serpent through the fog, swallowing the headlights one curve at a time. When Daniel reached the last wooden fence, his phone lost signal, and the world seemed to slip backward 100 years. Silence hung over the barns and fields, too still, too practiced, as if the people who lived here were listening rather than sleeping. He parked near the edge of the woods where the letter had told him to look. The air smelled of pine, damp earth, and something older like decay wrapped in prayer. In the distance, a single lantern flickered in an attic window before going dark. The locals had warned him not to stay after sundown, not to ask about the woman who once lived beyond the tree line. But curiosity is a hunger stronger than fear, and Daniel had come too far to turn back. The cabin appeared after an hour's walk, half consumed by the forest. Its door was chained shut, the boards blackened with time. When he pressed his ear to the wood, he thought he heard something faint from inside, a lullaby, almost human, almost pleading. The same tune that would follow him for the rest of his life, echoing from the graves no one dared to mark. The outsider arrived in the Amish valley just as the first fog of autumn began to crawl over the fields, softening the edges of the barns and fences. His name was Daniel, a journalist known for chasing stories others deemed too quiet or too far removed from modern life to matter. What drew him here wasn't a headline but a letter, typed on an old typewriter and signed only with the initials EM. It spoke of a secret buried deep within an isolated Amish settlement, a secret that had lived in whispers, locked behind barns and Bible verses, for more than a century. The letter hinted at a woman named Eliza and a sin so grave that even her descendants refused to acknowledge her existence. Daniel had seen hoaxes before, but something about the tone of that letter, the trembling language, the plea for truth, felt different, almost desperate. He arrived expecting resistance, but what he found was silence. The locals spoke with guarded politeness, answering his questions with rehearsed detachment. Their eyes would shift to one another whenever he mentioned the forest that bordered the valley. The old man who ran the general store told him there were no families by the name mentioned in his notes, yet his hands shook when Daniel unfolded the letter on the counter. Children stared at him from behind the slats of buggies, their faces pale and unreadable. It was as if the entire community had agreed to erase something, and his presence was the first disturbance in decades. Daniel rented a room in an old farmhouse owned by a widow who kept her curtains closed even at noon. She warned him, without meeting his gaze, not to wander after dark. Her words were almost mechanical, a ritual she seemed to have repeated before. He could sense her fear but also her guilt, as if she carried the weight of knowledge she would never share. At night, he heard distant sounds, metal creaking, a faint melody like a lullaby carried on the wind. Every instinct told him to leave, but that same unease drew him further in. The deeper he looked, the more the valley seemed to breathe, watching him through its stillness. When he finally saw the boundary where the cultivated fields met the untouched woods, he understood what the locals refused to say. The forest didn't just grow there, it guarded something. The air grew colder as he approached the first line of trees, and in the fading light, he thought he saw a figure watching him from the shadows. Whether it was a trick of the mist or something else, he couldn't tell. But he knew, without question, that whatever waited inside those woods had been waiting for him. The next morning, the fog lifted just enough to reveal the shape of the land, the sloping fields, the scattered barns, and beyond them, the thick wall of trees that marked the edge of the settlement. Daniel followed a narrow dirt path that twisted through the woods, led only by the vague directions written at the bottom of the letter. The handwriting there had changed, as if written in haste. It spoke of a house that remembers, a place left untouched for generations. The locals had called it cursed, though no one used that word aloud. After nearly an hour of walking, Daniel caught sight of the structure, a sagging wooden cabin nearly swallowed by vines and moss, its roof collapsing inward, its windows black with soot and age. The air around it was different, heavier, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. He stepped closer, and the first thing he noticed was the smell. It wasn't rot, not exactly, but a strange mix of mildew and something faintly metallic, like old blood. The door was chained shut, though the lock had long rusted away. A wooden cross hung upside down above the entrance, nailed there by a trembling hand decades ago. Daniel hesitated before pushing the door open, its hinges groaning as if protesting the intrusion. Inside, the light barely reached. The dust hung thick, stirred only by his movements. Broken furniture lay scattered, a table overturned, a child's chair missing a leg. On one wall, there were faint markings, scratches carved in desperation. He moved closer and realized they were tallies, hundreds of them, carved unevenly into the wood, as though someone had been counting days that never ended. In the corner stood a small bed frame, its sheets yellowed and brittle. On the floor beside it were several hand-carved dolls, each deformed in a different way, one missing a head, another with two faces, another bound tightly in twine. He knelt to examine them and noticed the initials EM burned faintly into the base of the smallest one. The same initials that had signed his letter. The chest mentioned in the message sat against the far wall, half buried beneath a pile of rotting quilts. Its metal latch had fused shut, and when he tried to lift it, the wood splintered. Something rattled inside, a soft, hollow sound like small bones shifting in the dark. The light flickered through a broken window as he stood there, heart pounding. Dust drifted like ash through the air. Somewhere behind the cabin, he heard a faint creak, the slow rhythm of a swing or a rope moving in the wind. When he turned toward the sound, there was no one there, only the empty forest, still and listening, as though it knew exactly what he had just found. When Daniel returned to the village, the weight of what he had seen in the cabin clung to him like the dampness of the woods. He tried to speak to the locals again, hoping someone would confirm the name from the letter, but the moment he mentioned it, Eliza, their expressions changed. The man at the blacksmith's shed dropped his tools without a word. A young mother pulled her children closer, whispering a prayer under her breath. Even the air seemed to grow colder when the name left his mouth, as if it carried something unholy. The reactions were too consistent to be coincidence. Everyone knew who she was, yet no one dared to admit it. When he pressed for answers, the people would only say that some stories were not meant to be retold. Their silence was not ignorance, it was fear disguised as faith. At the local meeting house, an elderly bishop listened as Daniel tried to explain his reason for coming. The old man's eyes, pale and watery, fixed on him with something between pity and warning. He told Daniel that Eliza had been gone a long time, that her name had been struck from every record, and that the Lord had punished her family for their sins. But when Daniel asked what sin was so terrible it needed to be erased from memory, the bishop's voice faltered. He only said, "She loved where love was forbidden," and then dismissed him with a prayer that sounded more like a dismissal of guilt. That evening, Daniel stopped by a small roadside stall run by a teenage girl. When he mentioned Eliza's name in passing, the girl froze, then quickly glanced toward the fields as if someone might be listening. She told him in a whisper that her grandmother once spoke of Eliza when she was young, before she was warned never to do so again. According to her, Eliza was a midwife who vanished after giving birth to her last child, though no one knew how many she had or who the father was. Some said she had gone mad, others said she had been taken away. The girl's voice trembled when she added that Eliza still walked in the woods on nights when the fog was thick, humming to the children she lost. Daniel left before sunset, his mind racing with fragments of fear and curiosity. The name Eliza no longer felt like a clue, it felt like a presence. Every time he tried to forget it, he could almost hear her name whispered back to him by the wind. In that moment, he began to understand that he wasn't chasing a story about the past anymore, he was being drawn into something still alive, something that refused to stay buried. The next day dawned grey and silent, the kind of morning that felt suspended between night and day. Daniel left the village early, following the dirt path behind the old meeting house that curved toward the forest. The fog lingered low, curling around his boots as he walked. He carried a lantern and the map he had drawn the previous night, marking where the locals' fear seemed to grow strongest in their voices. The letter had mentioned resting places the church could not bless, and something in those words guided his steps. The deeper he went into the woods, the quieter everything became. No birds, no wind, only the faint crunch of his shoes against the damp soil. After nearly an hour, the trees opened into a clearing, small and sunken, the ground uneven and soft beneath a carpet of leaves. It was there that he saw them. 5 small wooden markers stood in a half-circle, each barely visible beneath years of moss and rot. They were crudely made, with no names or carvings, only uneven stones placed beside them, as if to weigh something down. The earth there had shifted in strange ways, sinking inward as if whatever lay beneath it had tried to rise and failed. Daniel crouched beside the first marker, brushing away the moss. Beneath it, faint symbols had been carved, crosses, stars, shapes he couldn't identify, perhaps desperate attempts to protect what couldn't be saved. When he moved to the second, he noticed the arrangement: 5 graves forming a perfect crescent, the open side facing the woods. It felt intentional, almost ceremonial, like a ritual meant to keep something inside rather than mourn what was gone. He knelt beside the last grave, smaller than the others, barely 3 feet long. The soil there looked disturbed, as if someone had been there not long ago. He saw wilted flowers, wild ones, freshly placed, their stems still wet with dew. Someone had been tending to these graves in secret. The thought made his stomach tighten. He reached for his camera, but just as he lifted it, a sound echoed from the trees, a soft humming, distant yet unmistakable. It was the same lullaby he had heard faintly in the cabin, slow and broken, drifting between the trees like a ghost of breath. He froze, the hair on his neck rising. The sound grew clearer, moving through the forest in a circle around him, though no one was visible. His lantern flickered once, twice, then went dark. For a moment, everything stilled except the soft rustle of leaves. Then he heard the whisper of a child's laugh, high, sharp, and near one of the graves. Daniel stumbled back, heart pounding, unsure whether to run or stay. When the light returned, the clearing was empty again, but he knew he wasn't alone. Something unseen was still watching him from behind the trees, as if guarding the only proof of what the valley had tried to forget. Back in the small farmhouse where he was staying, Daniel spent the night piecing together the fragments of what he had uncovered. The graves, the cabin, and the whispered name all pointed toward something much older than the people around him admitted. The next morning, he went to the church archives, a modest stone building at the far edge of the settlement. The caretaker, an elderly man with trembling hands, reluctantly let him inside after Daniel mentioned he was researching genealogy. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the faint scent of ink. Rows of ledgers lined the walls, their spines cracked and faded. Daniel began searching through the old baptism and birth records, tracing the surnames that matched the initials on the letter. Hours passed before he found something that made his breath catch. The name Eliza Miller appeared, but the records abruptly stopped after 1902. Every page that should have followed had been torn out, leaving only jagged remnants. Someone had deliberately erased her from the church's memory. He turned to the marriage records, and there, tucked between 2 brittle pages, he found a note written in the same trembling typewriter font as the letter he had received. It listed 5 births within a 6-year span, each child marked as deceased at birth. There was no father's name, only a small cross in the margin, a symbol that the church used for cases deemed unholy. The discovery unsettled him more deeply than he expected. He read the entries again and again, and every time, the silence of the room seemed to deepen. When he asked the caretaker about the missing pages, the old man's demeanor changed instantly. He reached out and shut the book, his knuckles pale with pressure, and told Daniel to leave them be. His eyes darted toward the window as though someone might be listening from outside. Before Daniel could protest, the man whispered that Eliza's father had been a respected church elder, a man the community still revered, and that his reputation had been protected at any cost. The words hung in the air like smoke. It was the confirmation Daniel both wanted and feared. Eliza's children had not been fatherless, they had been born of a sin that the church itself had buried. The realization made his stomach tighten, but what disturbed him most was how deliberately it had all been covered. Every document, every mention, carefully destroyed, as if the act of erasing her name could cleanse the bloodline. As Daniel left the archive, the church bell rang above him, its echo carrying through the valley like a warning. The air outside felt heavier, the shadows longer, and he understood for the first time that what he was uncovering was not just a forgotten tragedy, it was a wound the community had chosen to keep open beneath layers of silence. The storm rolled in that night without warning, the wind moaning through the trees as rain hammered the windows of the farmhouse. Daniel sat by the dim light of his lantern, surrounded by the notes he had gathered, the torn pages, the photographs of the graves, the cryptic letter that had brought him here. Sleep refused to come. Something in the caretaker's trembling voice kept replaying in his head, and the mention of Eliza's father as a respected elder gnawed at him. He felt there was still proof somewhere, something tangible that tied the story together. He decided to search the attic, a place the widow who owned the house had told him to stay out of, claiming it was unsafe. The staircase creaked under his weight as he climbed, the air growing colder with every step. The attic door resisted, swollen by years of humidity, and when it finally gave way, a gust of dust and stale air spilled out. The light from his lantern revealed a space cluttered with relics of the past, crates of yellowed linens, jars of preserved fruit long turned to murky liquid, and a trunk pushed against the far wall. He wiped away the cobwebs and lifted the lid, half expecting nothing but old clothes. Instead, he found a small wooden box wrapped in black fabric. Inside were letters, brittle photographs, and a Bible with pages warped from age. As he sifted through them, his hand stopped on one photograph that made his stomach tighten. It was a portrait of a woman, Eliza. Her face was pale, almost fragile, framed by a dark bonnet. Standing beside her was a man whose hand rested firmly on her shoulder, his expression unreadable but his grip too intimate to be paternal. The resemblance between them was undeniable. The photo was dated 1901, a year before the records ended. The back of the photograph had faint handwriting, "The Lord sees all." Below it, the initials EM appeared again. Daniel stared at it for a long moment, the rain tapping insistently against the roof as thunder rolled outside. There was something in Eliza's eyes that unsettled him, not just sadness but a silent plea, as if she had known her story would one day resurface. He felt a strange weight in the air, a thickness that pressed against his chest. Then he noticed something else, the same lullaby again, faint, coming from somewhere beneath the floorboards, as if the house itself remembered her. The melody was slow and fragile, almost like a child's voice humming in the dark. Daniel froze, clutching the photograph tightly as the lantern flickered. He realized then that Eliza's presence had never left this place. The photograph was not merely evidence, it was a haunting, a piece of her that had refused to fade, waiting for someone to finally see what had been hidden in plain sight. The following morning, the storm had passed, but the air carried the stillness that follows something unsettled. Daniel went into town to speak with the only person who hadn't completely turned him away, an elderly Amish woman named Ruth, who lived on the far side of the settlement. She was known among the locals as a healer, someone who remembered things others preferred to forget. When Daniel arrived, Ruth greeted him at the door with wary eyes, her hands trembling slightly as she motioned for him to come in. Her home was sparse but clean, the faint smell of herbs and smoke lingering in the air. She didn't ask why he had come, she already seemed to know. Without a word, she poured him tea and sat across from him, her gaze fixed on the table. After a long silence, she spoke the name that no one else would, Eliza. Her voice was low, each word chosen with the careful weight of someone who had lived too long with fear. She told Daniel that Eliza had been her mother's cousin, a kind woman who helped deliver babies when the town had no doctor. But something happened, Ruth said, something that changed her from a midwife into an outcast. The children she gave birth to weren't like the others, and the elders called it a curse from God. Ruth's eyes filled with tears as she confessed that her mother had seen Eliza after the last child was born, blooded, delirious, and holding something wrapped in cloth. The next morning, Eliza and her father were both gone, and no one spoke of them again. Ruth leaned closer, her voice barely above a whisper, and said that sometimes at night she still heard crying near the woods, where the graves lay. Before Daniel could ask more, Ruth gripped his hand tightly and warned him to leave before nightfall. She said that people who went looking for Eliza's truth always disappeared or returned changed, as if touched by something that didn't belong to this world. Her words were shaky, desperate, and her eyes darted toward the window, scanning the fields beyond her house. Daniel promised her he'd be careful, though even as he said it, he knew he wouldn't stop. He left her home with the photograph still in his pocket, his mind burning with questions. That night, he returned to check on Ruth, unable to shake a growing sense of dread. The lights in her house were off, though her front door stood ajar, swaying gently in the wind. Inside, everything was in disarray, chairs overturned, drawers open, the teacup she had used earlier shattered on the floor. Ruth was gone. No footprints led away from the house, only the faint scent of earth and rain, as though she had simply vanished into the night, taking the rest of Eliza's story with her. Daniel barely slept that night, his mind caught between disbelief and fear. Ruth's disappearance gnawed at him, her warnings echoing in every creak of the house. By morning, the valley was wrapped in mist again, the kind that made the world feel smaller and more haunted. He couldn't ignore the feeling that the answers he sought were back in the cabin, the place where it had all begun. He packed his lantern, camera, and recorder, determined to document whatever he found. The path through the woods felt different this time, quieter, as if the forest was listening. Every step seemed to sink deeper into the earth, every branch shifting in the corners of his vision. When the cabin came into view, it was almost unrecognizable. The vines had spread further up the walls, and the air around it hung thick with damp decay. He pushed the door open, and the hinges wailed like a cry. Inside, the room was exactly as he had left it, yet something felt wrong. The dolls he had seen before were now positioned differently, as if they had been moved in his absence. He tried to dismiss it as his memory playing tricks, but unease crawled beneath his skin. Setting his recorder on the table, he began describing the interior, the carvings, the smell until he heard it again. A faint sound beneath the floorboards, rhythmic and slow, like breathing. He froze, crouching low to listen. It came again, a creak followed by what sounded like a hum, the same melody that had haunted him since the first night. Heart pounding, he found a loose plank near the bed frame and pried it up. The air that rose from the gap was cold and sour, and his lantern light revealed a hollow space beneath the cabin, lined with stone and dirt. He lowered the lantern, and the light caught something glinting, metal, perhaps. He reached down and pulled up a rusted cradle, its wood nearly eaten away by time. Inside lay a torn piece of fabric embroidered with the initials EM, and beside it, a small silver cross. The moment his fingers brushed the cradle, the humming grew louder, echoing all around the room. It wasn't coming from beneath him anymore, it was inside the cabin. The dolls began to sway slightly, moved by no visible wind, and the lantern flickered violently. Then came the faint creak of footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving across the floor behind him. Daniel turned, but the doorway was empty. The humming stopped abruptly, leaving only silence thick enough to feel. Then something whispered his name, so close it brushed his ear, and the lantern went out completely. In that absolute darkness, he realized the cabin wasn't abandoned at all, it was waiting. The days that followed blurred together in Daniel's mind, a mix of exhaustion and obsession. He could no longer tell where fear ended and curiosity began. The more he uncovered, the more he felt the story was beginning to turn inward, drawing him into the very curse he was trying to expose. He sent a sample of the fabric and hair he had found beneath the cabin to a friend at a local university for DNA testing, claiming it was for a genealogy project. He didn't tell her the full truth, he didn't need to. All he wanted was confirmation that Eliza had existed, that her children had been real. While he waited for the results, he noticed changes around him. The villagers had grown colder, distant. Conversations stopped when he entered a room. Once, he caught a glimpse of a man watching him from across the field, dressed in traditional Amish clothing but standing completely still, even as the wind moved the wheat around him. When Daniel blinked, the man was gone. 3 days later, the results arrived in an email. The message was short, clinical, but what it said made Daniel's hands tremble. The DNA from the fabric contained a match not to any historical record, but to a living person. The match was nearly perfect and belonged to a family still residing in the same Amish valley, a name Daniel recognized immediately from one of his earlier interviews. The bloodline hadn't ended a century ago as everyone believed, it had continued, hidden beneath generations of silence. The deformities had lessened over time, diluted by distance and secrecy, but the connection was unmistakable. Eliza's descendants were still there, living quietly among those who pretended she never existed. Daniel felt an uneasy mixture of triumph and dread. He had proof now, something undeniable. But as night fell, that victory turned sour. The power in the farmhouse flickered, then failed entirely, plunging the house into shadow. From outside came the faint creak of wagon wheels, though no one used them this late. He looked out the window and saw figures moving through the mist, several of them, their lanterns swinging like fireflies in the dark. They stopped at the edge of the property, silent, unmoving. Daniel's breath caught when he realized every one of them was facing his window, their faces hidden by the brims of their hats. The sound of the lullaby began again, faint at first, then rising from all around him. It was the same melody, the same rhythm he had heard in the woods, in the cabin, under the floor. But now it wasn't an echo. It was alive, carried by voices that belonged not to ghosts, but to blood still living, still guarding, still remembering what should have died long ago. By the time Daniel realized what the truth meant, it was already too late to separate himself from it. The valley, the woods, and the people had all become part of the same pulse, beating with a secret that refused to rest. The night after he discovered the DNA results, he gathered his notes and prepared to leave, but something in him hesitated. He wanted one final confirmation, something tangible to close the story. He returned to the church just before dawn, the old stone building looming like a sentinel over the sleeping village. The door was unlocked, as if someone had been expecting him. Inside, the air was cold and damp. The candles on the altar had burned low, their wax pooled into strange shapes. Daniel walked down the aisle, the echo of his footsteps breaking the silence. On the pulpit lay a Bible, open to a page that had been underlined in red, *, the sins of the father shall be visited upon the children. *, he closed the book and looked up to see movement in the shadows. A man stepped forward, one of the elders he had interviewed days before. His face was lined, his eyes unreadable. He told Daniel that there was no need to dig further, that the story he sought wasn't history, it was inheritance. The elder said the bloodline could never be broken because it had been sealed by faith and punishment. As he spoke, others entered through the back door, men and women, all dressed in black, their expressions solemn, their eyes fixed on Daniel. The elder continued, saying the valley survived by keeping its secrets buried and that those who unearthed them were bound to join them. Daniel backed away, his voice trembling as he insisted he only wanted the truth. But the truth was already around him. They led him outside into the mist, where the sound of the lullaby returned, sung softly by unseen voices in the trees. The group stopped at the edge of the woods, and the elder pointed toward the clearing where Daniel had found the graves. Lanterns hung from branches, casting a dim orange light over the earth. In the center of the clearing, a sixth marker had been placed, new, clean, its wood still pale. Daniel's breath caught when he saw his own name carved into it. The crowd behind him began to hum, the same slow, sorrowful melody that had haunted him since the beginning. The elder whispered that every story must return to its roots, and that some roots are watered only with silence. Daniel tried to step back, but the fog thickened, wrapping around him like a living thing. The last thing he heard was the lullaby, close and tender now, before the light of his lantern flickered out and the woods swallowed him, keeping the secret unbroken for another generation.